Hello again, gang. KR King here, helping one and all homebrew their own D&D campaign. And today I'm going to talk about the composition of players in your group. And I don't mean in terms of the player characters that they have. What I'm talking about is the players themselves and, the numbers of them and their experience vis-a-vis, gaming in general, their outlook, because it makes a huge difference in terms of how you homebrew encounters and how the storylines of your world and how things unfold. This video was inspired by a video by Matt Colville earlier this month, which was about the difficulty of talking about D&D. What he referred to was in terms of talking about encounter design or modules or adventures, how things might unfold, the challenge ratings and whatnot. And that's interesting because I just finished a series on, level 2 of the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, and many times throughout those videos I would say, this is designed for 4 6th level characters, and I would say, depending if you have more characters or they're, different levels or, and then of course, what is the party composition, it makes a difference. But when I saw Matt's videos, like a lot of them, I thought to myself, he's exactly right. It makes a big difference the kind of players you have, what they bring to the table, what their expectations are, their experiences. So I'm using that as a starting point, I'm going to talk about my views on this based on my own history of playing D&D, how it's evolved, and how I've noticed when creating, a world and then, the personages and the encounters of that world, thinking about the players that I have at the table has in fact made a huge difference. All right, so the first thing I would say, of course, is to watch Matt's video. I'll give a link down here. Most of you are, probably are, subscribers to his channel already. But I'll put a link in there, and I'm going to put a link to another video that I'm going to mention later in this video so that you can watch that. What I'm going to talk about, he says there's 2 ideas here in terms of thinking about how an adventure module or something that's prepared, and obviously for my purposes, how you're going to create an adventure in a world, is the 2 things are the number of characters or players you have at the table, and then 2, what is their experience level, where do they come from, and obviously this would range from 1 player on up to however many you can imagine. And he does this thing from being a wargamer, coming at it from that standpoint, to being a social gamer, someone that just comes to, whether it's role-playing or they don't want to get bogged down in rules or anything, they just want to have fun, they want to create a character and interact. And this really got me thinking about the origins of my own experience with Dungeons & Dragons, because I came at this as a very hardcore wargamer. If you looked at, took a scale from 1 to 100, I'd be 99 to 100 in terms of wargaming. I mean, I was a lifetime subscriber to the SBI magazine Strategy and Tactics, which then went out of business. That was a good investment. I played a ton of games. This is the old terrible Swift Sword game, one of these monster games from the 70s, recreating the Battle of Gettysburg. And it's interesting, while I was searching through my game boxes, I found this old Dragon Quest. This was SPI's attempt to, create a role-playing fantasy game. It's a pretty decent game. It works, but, obviously compared, we were so used to the TSR system and whatnot, it never really took off. And my best friend at the time, when we were 13, 14, when we started playing D&D, a guy named Jeff Stern, also a big war gamer. I played hundreds of, strategy and tactics, Avalon Hill games, all that stuff with him, with other friends. It's interesting, Matt Colville in his video talks about how they used to have a rating of, for complexity and then solitaire capabilities on all these games. And the solitaire was because there weren't that many people that played them. I happened to know a whole bunch of people in my hometown, Rochester Hills, Michigan, where we had a lot of people that played. So yes, you would play games solitaire, but we had players. And Jeff and I, in the mid-70s, we were like 13 years old, we found out about this Pontiac Wargamer Society. Pontiac was this town near my town. It was kind of a rough and tumble, been an industrial center, now it collapsed. The downtown was all collapsed, and people would rent out these storefronts, and these guys rented out storefronts and created the Pontiac Wargamers Society. So Jeff and I, we get our parents to drive us down to downtown Pontiac, which was kind of a seedy area, this storefront, noon on a Saturday. We go in there, and there's all these guys in their late 20s to 50s playing these miniatures on these giant tables, right? They were medieval miniatures. And they just took us in as kind of these mascots, these 2 kids that just showed up. And we learned all about playing miniatures. In fact, I wrote a miniature thing called Situation Critical, which was small arms tactical combat in the late 20th century or whatever. It wasn't very good. I was 14 years old, but Jeff and I would play it in my basement, and we'd set up, figures. I think it was on our ping pong table, because we were so into the idea of creating war games and stuff using these, figures and distances. And we brought this to the table with D&D. Because when you started with D&D, you had these 3 books, and you had your reference sheets. This was it. Now, then later we had the additional books. I've got them all here. First you had Greyhawk, then came Blackmore, and then came Eldritch Wizardry. And these were basically the books that we played with. Now, these weren't really suitable, as there was all sorts of holes in the rules, things that didn't make sense, things that, contradicted other things. And what happened with players in those days, we created our own rule book. And I've just got some of these. These are all folders of homebrewed rules that we used in those days. And in fact, when the first edition came out, I, of course, bought it. I thought it was very interesting, but it was also very, to me, overwritten. I mean, there were charts for everything and whatnot, and the appendices were really good. But, we had this whole system, and really the only thing from first edition that I ever used regularly was this monster manual. This I used all the time, but I continued to use my own set of rules. And so that game we played at the very beginning, that first iteration of D&D, was tactical, was from a wargaming perspective, battles, battles, battles. But I got out of high school, and I went to college, and a friend of mine, Mike Katona, who lived in my dorm, I went to Michigan State, not far from where I grew up. So at Michigan State, I knew a lot of people, and he said, "Oh, you're going to run D&D?" And at first I was like, no, I just want to experience college. I was having a good time. But eventually some people came around, they heard about it, and I started running. And these were people that did not come from a wargaming background. So I had a really good friend who still is one, Wendy Williams. In fact, she's a subscriber to my channel. Hello, Wendy. And she was not a wargamer at all, but she liked to play. And she had a different style. She had her character, who was Wentula, and she was a fighter, the character on a bullwhip. She made some changes. She said, "Why should female characters have a -2 strength?" And we'd say, "Oh, you get a bonus on your charisma." And she said, "No, I want to be the same as you guys." And so from then on, we said, okay, female characters, they just roll your dice, no penalties or whatnot, right? Things changed because of her influence. A lot more role playing, a lot more of thinking about, and for me, developing as a GM or referee, as we used to say in those days, I started creating more elaborate storylines. We would have a tribunal or something, or maybe an election in town, or a new king is coming aboard, and we'd have all these intrigues and whatnot. It wasn't just the rolling of the dice, because we had a different perspective. And another interesting thing, a really good friend of mine, Norm Taylor, also lived in the floor. He was African American. When we talked about slaves in the D&D thing, he was very, he would never allow slaves. He wanted to wipe them out. He had a different perspective. And I developed a thing in my world, lawful good and even neutral people were totally opposed to slavery. We didn't have it. Evil characters would do this, and the player characters, Norm especially, but all of us, we would, try to stop this. Again, it was influenced by the players that are at the table. And then, of course, Matt talks about how many players you have. In those early days in high school and in college, I had a lot of players, 4 or 5 at a time. When things really got going, both in high school and in college, although I finally had to people were flunking out of class, we used to play, 2 or 3 times a week sometimes, 4 or 5 people. And again, the dynamics of that in terms of designing encounters, how things were going to unfold, is a lot different when you have less players, which was my next campaign. What happened was people, we got out of college, we would have one-shots and stuff sometimes, get together with the old gang, and I just put together a little adventure just for that evening, but we didn't have an ongoing campaign. And then a good friend of mine, Paul Michaud, who is actually not a subscriber, he hates YouTube, but he said, "I want to play a game. I want to just play with just us." And so I went out and I got this rule set, the Rules Cyclopedia, which was the old basic system reconfigured. Most of it is the same. There were some changes. And I used this, and we played a solo campaign. Just Paul running. Now, in those days, it wasn't truly solo at the beginning. I would have a few NPCs, but I didn't have 6 NPCs. He didn't want to run them. I didn't want to run them. So I adjusted the game because of the number of players. Now, he was a very wargamey guy. He was a guy from my hometown who I played with in high school, but having just one or maybe three guys, two NPCs and himself, he wouldn't want to get into too many battles, especially at lower levels. It became more role-playing, more situations where Paul had to talk his way, in or out of trouble. And eventually another friend of ours, Dave Zimmerman, who's out there, so I don't think he subscribes, I'm not sure, but he decided, I heard about this. Again, we played in high school. He joined the game. It got a little more tactical in a way, but still we had to do that social thing because by the time they got up in higher levels, they got a lot of powers. They didn't need the NPCs as much, right? And they got items and things that protected them, which is what I did in order for them to survive battles. Because we still are, the three of us were war gamers. We still wanted that effect. So then in the mid-90s, I moved to California, Hollywood, California. I'm a writer and I was doing projects. I'm also a filmmaker, documentaries. That's a whole nother long story. But there I am in Los Angeles, mid-90s. My friend Norm Taylor had also moved to LA a few years before. So he, used to come over all the time, and there were guys across the hall. Vic Gonzalez is one of them. He is a subscriber. If you're watching, hey, Vic. Lived across the hall, and they were playing D&D. So Norm and I went over there. We started talking to him. And they said, oh, you guys play? There was like three guys there. So we sit in, and we roll characters. Well, they didn't use figures. They were not war gamers. They just played D&D. They had learned it kind of on their own, and they just didn't think about figures. They just all theater of the mind. And I had said, famous quote from Vic, where I said, hey, how come you guys don't have figures? And he goes, figures? Who needs figures? And they all laughed. Well, what happened was Norm kept bugging me. You should start your campaign again. Let's run, let's run. So finally I did. And the guys all came over to my apartment across the hall. But I said, in my campaign, I use figures. I use miniatures. We have, graphs. I have drawing mat, with putting them on, drawing them out. And they were like, oh, okay. Well, as it turned out, they really liked this. They started to get into the battles, the tactical elements. They began to learn tactics, and I would have Norm, of course, was very experienced at this. And this is a thing that Matt Colville talks about in his video. If you have one player, which we did, Norm Taylor, who is a really good tactician, really understands wargaming and battles, it changes things. He dominates in those situations until the other players come along. And these guys were interested. They weren't they weren't like, what, I don't like this, right? They just played along. Then we would have role-playing situations. Then we would have and I took a little more hands-off approach about, entering buildings, or I didn't, force you to necessarily map out a dungeon if it wasn't necessary, because these guys had a much more of a social sense of the game. Now, again, they grew up with this themselves. They had grown up playing D&D. And so, they understood that from what the game was about. They didn't just come at this, from like a TV show type background. And the thing about that campaign with Vic and those guys and Norm in my apartment building, we ran every weekend for over a year. Now, I might not be remembering that, Vic, if you're out there, comment, but I believe that's the case. That's how into it we were. And the other thing about this was these guys played second edition. And, I had the rules encyclopedia, but they were like, oh, no, you got to play second edition, Kevin. This is a great game. So I, went out and I bought the second edition rules, read them, and I thought, you know what? This is pretty good. This is a lot different than that first edition Gary Gygax where it's a pain to find anything and the index is terrible. It's overwritten. It's overcomplicated. This is really good. So I started playing second edition. And again, this change, I used to think, second edition is the reason that, we got more into the role playing. Things got a little more, loosey-goosey or whatever, because I didn't have my homemade rules or I didn't have the rules encyclopedia. But I think it was, as Matt Colville says in his video, it was the composition of the players. All right, so the next thing that happened, this is in the late 90s. Jeff Stern also lives in Los Angeles. And when he heard I was moving there, he wanted to play. We played some one-shot games, whatnot, with my old rules. And he heard I said, I'm playing this campaign with these guys, in my apartment building. And so he came over a couple times. He wasn't really interested in joining their game again. He's a hardcore wargamer. But what happened was in 2000, he says to me, you know what, Kevin, there's a new edition of Dungeons & Dragons 3.0. You got to check this out. It's incredible. It's so much better organized. There's so much more options. So, of course, I'm thinking, I got to buy another, $100 and something worth of books, but I bought 3.0. Then I bought 3.5 a few years later. That was irritating. But I did find this system to be great. Jeff said, I want to put together a campaign with some guys that I went to college with. Well, Jeff went to college at Caltech, which is full of brainiac wargamers. So these guys were hardcore, min-max, wargaming, every advantage. It was a ton of work to, create encounters, monsters, NPCs that could battle them. It really made, running these things very difficult. And, I've got two sets, two sets of manuals here. These are both players' handbooks, because the way these rules were, if someone came along and played and didn't have a manual, you really needed to be checking things all the time. It was really hard to just memorize stuff with the 3.5 system, at least for me and even my brainiac Caltech friends. And Norm Taylor joined. He learned 3.5. He loved it as well. We had Jeff Stern was a rocket scientist. Norm Taylor was an engineer. Barry Maurer was a heart surgeon. There was another guy from Caltech that worked with Jeff, and another guy who was a game designer. You can imagine how this was just a pain in the ass. And the other thing that changed for me was I got married, and my wife started saying, "What is this D&D?" And she looked at it. I think she tried to play one time. She wasn't interested. But she's like, it takes up so much of your time. Because remember, I'm always, all through these periods, I'm homebrewing a campaign. I was of the old school. You just bought, modules just for the maps because, someone could, it was a pride thing, I'm sure, or something like that. I still, to this day, I've run in modules. So I'm coming up with the entire world. I'm coming up with all the NPCs, all the encounters, everything. And when you're in the 3.5 world, this was very complicated. And it started to wear on me. I ran from 2000 to 2008, 8 years, once a month in this campaign. That was a hell of a campaign. But what happened, of course, one guy, Barry, moved to Texas, Norm moved to Arizona, and I got a job that was much more time consuming. And I said, you know what, I got to take a break. And so then I didn't run for a few years, maybe an occasional one shot when we get together, this sort of thing. And then I get a call from my friend Jeff Stern, and he tells me that he has cancer, and it's stage 4, and he's not going to make it. And of course I say, oh my gosh, what can I do for you, Jeff? What can I do? This is 2012. And he says, I would love it if you'd run another D&D campaign. What can I do? So I put it all together. I created this campaign. I've talked about the premise on this channel where you're thrown into a world. Everyone doesn't know each other. They've had some weird experience. They're on a seashore and they have to figure this out. And we ran once a month for a year. We ran right up until 3 weeks before Jeff died. And it was a different kind of campaign because there was I used to throw all the old school, like the Mind Flayer, the Umber Hulk, the Beholder. I would have these battles, these set pieces that reminded us of those early days back in high school, running the one-shots, in the 80s, the 90s campaigns, and then, of course, the 2000 campaign. And all of it was kind of designed. I had this thing where they were escaping from this prison dimension into this next world. And I didn't finish it. I didn't have Jeff, go to this. I wanted to keep it in mid-form, just like sometimes when you have campaigns that kind of fade off and you say, we'll get together again, we'll do it next time, even though you kind of know once it loses steam or people move away, it doesn't come back. And the thing about this was, after Jeff died in 2013, I had no desire to play D&D. Put the books away. In fact, I've lost a bunch of books. Part of it is moving back and forth, but put them away. Then I went to Poland. I got a job teaching in Poland. I didn't think about D&D. I really thought I was never going to play again. And I'm looking on YouTube one day. My wife, is a long story. She left early. She had another job in the States. She was there for 3.5 years, but she left. I'm there by myself. I can't watch Polish TV, cable. I'm watching YouTubes and things. And I find this video about, I knew that 5.0 was out there, but I found this video by Matt Colville where he interviews Jim Murphy. And if you look on my channel, Jim Murphy's one of the channels that I feature on my channel. And I love his channel. He has a video on Don't Be That Guy that you should check out. But this was an interview that Matt conducted with Jim Murphy. It's 2 hours long. And I have watched that I don't know how many times. It just totally reminded me of why I played D&D, why I, spent all those years and all that time creating worlds, running with people, and Jim was clearly, I'd never played with him, never seen him play, never played with him, but I could tell he's one of the greatest, referees / GMs that ever lived, right? You could just tell. He knew it all. He knew mistakes he had made, good things he'd done, why people, lost interest in a campaign, and he would listen. He would listen. And of course, Matt's in the background. If you'll see, the quality's not up to what Matt does now, although maybe just because he was outside. He's in there and they're talking about this thing. And I just feel like when I watched this, I thought to myself, I got to get back into D&D. I got to play. And I came back to the United States. 2019, bought the books, and I went to a game store, Legacy Comics, and there was a group playing there, much younger than me. We start playing, and I realize they're playing a Waterdeep campaign. And I start to realize these guys are coming at this from a totally different perspective than the D&D that I'm used to. It's social. It's fun. When they created their clerics, they were the Church of Keanu Reeves, right? It was like Keanu Reeves, 20 years ago, all these people that I was talked about in this video would have been, what the hell is that? But you know what? They were having fun. They didn't worry about stuff. We had battles, but they were very loosey-goosey, no figures. We just talked in this game store. And it was really fun. And now this was a module, and I realized this. And then I went online, we had the COVID thing, so I'm on Fantasy Grounds. I bought a copy of that. I get on there, I get on some boards. I start playing in all these people's games. I start to see, I run some stuff with people. And I realized that the game is, you can find people that want to just do the hardcore wargaming. You can find people that want to do the social. And what I found is I kind of like a in-between a little bit, right? And you got to find those groups, and you got to find those people. And again, how many people you have, but also this thing, it changes the way the game is played. And what's interesting is people talk about fluff versus crunch, right? Crunch is the hard statistics, and fluff is the sort of dungeon master storylines. I think this is where there's an element here where the fluff of the style of play that your players want is the crunch of how to create a homebrewed campaign and create homebrewed encounters that interest them, that are fun, that work out well, that are balanced. And Matt in the video talks about modules and stuff, running these where, depending on the number of players or that we have one tactician, can really make a balance issue with some preset encounter. And he even talks in there a little bit about changing it in mid-form, which is very interesting. But I'm saying that when you're designing encounters and when you're designing a world and how it's going to unfold, you want to think about who's at the table and what they bring in terms of their outlook on the game. Because especially newer players, but even in the day, there were players that just want to have a social, a fun time. They don't want to learn the rules, really. They don't want to memorize all these charts. They don't understand the battle. They get bored in long battles. Then you make them a little shorter. Or you have players that's what they want to do. They want to fight monsters, and they want monsters that fight well, that use tactics, that are really out there to get them. And so that's my lesson from this video. One, think about your group, their outlook, their experience, what they're interested in, and how many you have in terms of balance. But also to say, hey, thank you, Jim Murphy out there and Matt Colville. I really was, I thought I was never going to play D&D again, and certainly that also inspired me to do this channel, and I love talking about D&D. It's I've had a late renaissance. This is my late period, as I say, with artists. And also thank all of you who watch my videos, who comment on them. In a way, we're all at this big table together with this great game. And if you like what you've seen on my channel, please subscribe, leave some comments. I'd love to hear stories about your groups that you've had, players that you've had. Most importantly, get those players together and keep playing Dungeons and Dragons, the greatest game ever invented. And I played them all. And tell somebody else about it.